190. Such as when Europeans die of AIDS, when a genetic researcher develops cancer, or when a space shuttle crashes, writes the Egyptian physician Khalid Montasser. These events are understood as God's punishment for people who see themselves as creators and lack humility before God. Muslims in the Middle Ages translated the works of other peoples, imported the art of paper making from China, and the decimal system of numbers from India. As early as the 13th century, the great philosopher Ibn Rushd, Averroes, spoke of the double electiveness, which allowed for a sharp separation between the rational findings of science and the metaphysical insights of faith. Science cannot confirm revelation, and revelation does not speak the language of science, therefore, they must neither exclude nor confirm each other, wrote the philosopher of Córdoba. Today, all Arab states together translate less in a year than what Greece or Spain translate into Greek or Spanish alone. Science is either neglected or used to prove that the statements of the Quran are correct. The book The Scientific Signs of the Quran has been a bestseller in all Arab states for years. In it, the author attempts to prove, for example, that the 191 Quran statements on the origin of the universe and the stages of life of an embryo in the womb correspond to the findings of modern science. This book is often used as a means of proselytizing young Europeans who have little scientific knowledge and are thus impressed by it. In their book The Unstoppable Revolution, Yosef Courbage and Emmanuel Todd note that the birth rate in the Islamic world is declining drastically. While in 1975, a Muslim woman gave birth to an average of 6.8 children, in 2005 it was only 3.7. In countries like Iran and Tunisia, the birth rate is said to have even fallen to the level of France. This development, the authors argue, is due to literacy, especially among women, which in turn can be interpreted as an expression of a disruption of traditional balances and family structures. Where women can read and write, the birth rate declines regardless of economic development. However, the decline in birth rates in a culture brings with it an identity crisis or a kind of collective depression. The authors establish a direct connection between demographic development and the collapse of religiosity, and not only in the case of Islam. Thus, the loss of faith was a direct consequence of the declining birth rate in Western Europe, Russia, and China. In the case of Islam, 192. The decline in religiosity was not, as is the case with Catholicism, a prerequisite for demographic modernization, i.e., reduction in birth rate. Rather, the opposite is true, since Islam is not fundamentally opposed to contraception. The authors view the advance of Islamism as merely a momentary movement and not the end of Islamic history. They interpret fundamentalism as a temporary act of self-defense by a faith under threat, calling its advocates to the fore. What the two statisticians fail to consider is that fundamentalism is not a modern phenomenon, but rather a recurring strategy of Muslims. However, their assessment is correct that the problem of contemporary Islam should be understood as a crisis of transition. Even at the end of the 19th century, the modernization of European societies revealed its dark side. The literacy of the masses and the heightening of their consciousness are always accompanied by social turmoil and massive psychological disturbances. The authors cite Émile Durkheim's 1897 study, which established a direct connection between the rising suicide rate and the increasing literacy of the French population at that time. The connection between suicide and economic growth can also be established in present day. 193. China and India. The authors make the mistake of comparing the suicide with the suicide attacks of Muslim terrorists. Because all sociological and psychological studies on the perpetrator's motives have ruled out mental or psychopathological disorders. In these cases, the perpetrators act out of conviction and not necessarily because they are tired of life. And yet, it remains understandable that literacy and modernization have a destabilizing effect on a society and bring about political upheaval, as the revolutions in England, France, and Russia demonstrate. In Indonesia, too, the education of broader sections of the population initially brought about violent outbreaks of violence before democratization took place. Sons who can read and write often do not accept their parents' authority and want to go their own way. Unfortunately, this does not yet apply to Muslim women. Furthermore, it is not only literacy that matters, but also what young people read. In addition to the aforementioned book The Scientific Signs of the Quran, most bookstores from Cairo to Casablanca often stock a wealth of religious books, which are usually 10 times cheaper than a novel or a political book. The majority of these books are subsidized. 194. With petrodollars and therefore spread a radical Wahhabi ideology about evil unbelievers and the torments of hell. Semi-educated, sexually frustrated, and economically dissatisfied young Muslims devour these books. Unlike illiterates, they also have access to the text of the Quran, something formerly reserved only for scholars. But they lack the analytical thinking necessary to protect them from the tyranny of dogma and the demagoguery of radical groups. At the same time, this young generation is more vulnerable to the seductions of modernity and consumerism than any other. Abdelwahab Meddeb speaks of an Americanization of modernity, which allows people to participate in consumer society without reforming their souls. The simultaneity of radicalization and Americanization exacerbates schizophrenia and corrodes the Arab world from within. Indeed, processes of individualization are taking place throughout the Islamic world. Sons are freeing themselves from their parents' mainstream Islam, which glorifies authority. But what alternatives do these young men find in the marketplace of faith and ideology? Since they find few civil society structures, they often end up with extremist groups that see Islam as a 195 revolution not against the old ways of thinking, but against the unbelievers. I share Youssef Korbaj's and Emmanuel Todd's assessment that religiosity is declining in the Islamic world and that the individual is increasingly becoming isolated from the pressure to conform. However, aside from the fact that one cannot understand the development of a culture through statistics alone, education and individualization alone are not sufficient to fundamentally change a society if they do not lead to democratic structures. The collapse of old structures can certainly lead to the release of criminal energies and anarchism. One thing, however, speaks in favor of Emmanuel Todd, one of the book's two authors. He was the one who predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union at a time when no one thought it possible. I would be very pleased if his prophecy about the rapid modernization of Islam were to come true. But my understanding tells me that this is wishful thinking. 196 Chapter 14 Between Renaissance and Radicalization, or Muslims in Foreign Countries. The downfall of Islam has already been indirectly prophesied by Muhammad himself. Muhammad also predicts the rebirth of Islam in a foreign environment. Islam is born a stranger and will return a stranger. This prophecy is interpreted in two ways. Reform-minded Muslims see in it the hope that the reform and liberalization of Islam will take place in the West. One of the proponents of this thesis is the London-based Islamic scholar and philosopher Tariq Ramadan, who advocates for radical reforms of Islam. According to Ramadan, only by allowing multiple identities, which allow a believer to be both Muslim and European, can Muslims gain a foothold in Europe. His radical reforms, however, appear to be nothing more than a sedative to defuse the controversy that has been sparked about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be. 197. Upon him. The verses of the Holy Book cannot be erased, Ramadan argues. He also does not question Sharia as a concept and guide for Muslims' lives. He does not want to return to Sharia law, however, but rather to its intentions, maqasid, which he identifies primarily as justice and peace. Not only Ramadan's charismatic qualities, but also the fact that he is the grandson of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, have gained him a large following among Muslims in Europe, but have also made him the most sought-after Islamic expert at many cultural events and even among European politicians. However, I consider Ramadan's discourse to be more part of the problem than part of the solution. While it gives the impression that something is moving, it's just the same old, worn-out reform formulas that, while using the word change, tend to strengthen rather than weaken established orthodox thought. The American-based Turkish Gülen movement, which considers itself an Islamic education and a progressive movement, can be compared to the Ramadan movement. Others see it as fundamentalist in a modern guise. The movement, founded by the Turkish preacher Fethullah Gülen, is said to already have several million followers in Turkey, North America, Europe, and the Muslim states of the former USSR. Over 1,000. 198 schools of the movement are said to exist worldwide. Islam critic Nikla Kalek accuses the movement's founder of a dogmatic and reactionary mindset and accuses him of political ambitions. In response to the institutionalization of Islam in Europe by conservative mosque associations, many private initiatives have emerged that give a voice to secular and liberal Muslims. The Women's Initiative of Secular Muslims in Frankfurt and the Forum for a Progressive Islam in Zurich are two examples. However, Orthodox Muslims in Europe seem to have more followers than Ramadan, Gülen, and the secular organizations. They interpret the Prophet's statement about the rebirth of Islam in foreign lands in a more militant and fundamentalist way. In a mosque in Paris, I heard the Imam interpret Muhammad's words as follows: "The rulers in the Islamic world are un-Islamic and oppress the believers. The rulers here, in Europe, are also un-Islamic, but they at least guarantee that we can practice our faith relatively freely. This allows us to gather without fear of being arrested. Therefore, we should not seek conflict with the systems here." 199. We must use this freedom to reorganize ourselves. The second birth of the power of Islam will take place here. And when God's victory comes, the unbelievers here will embrace Islam in droves. Islam, too, was born in a migration context in Medina. Muslims were foreign and weak there, but later, with Allah's help, they were able to establish the state of God before carrying Islam back to Mecca. We, too, can export a strong Islam back to the Islamic world. We owe this to our oppressed brothers there. The words of that Parisian imam are reminiscent of Recep Tayyip Erdogan's speech before becoming Prime Minister of Turkey. In it, he emphasized that democracy was merely the train he was riding until he reached his destination. Mosques were barracks, minarets were bayonets, domes were helmets, and believers were soldiers. This is precisely where I see the main problem of Muslim emigrants in Europe and North America. Instead of using their freedom to break away from authoritarian thinking and claims to power and to allow a new theology based on reason to emerge in Europe, they are using democratic 200 means to undermine democracy. In Canada and Great Britain, Muslims have been fighting for years to introduce Sharia, at least in part. In Great Britain, according to a report in the British newspaper Guardian, 85 Sharia courts are already part of the British judicial system. These Muslim zealots cannot understand that many immigrants from Islamic countries have left their countries partly because of the brutality of Sharia. Naturally, they emphasize that only Sharia light, meaning without stoning and chopping off hands, should be implemented in the West in order to resolve family conflicts Islamically. But the mentality that considers Western civil law deficient in this regard is far more dangerous than the mere introduction of Sharia law. Therefore, in my view, the only solution is not Sharia light, but Islam light, without Sharia and jihad. Instead of seeing their lives in the West as an incentive for a genuine renewal of Islamic thought, which they would later export to their countries of origin. Many Muslims living abroad seek to import the outdated thinking from their homeland, freeze it in the freezer of tradition, and call it identity. Instead of becoming actors to bring the Islamic world out of isolation and serve as cultural mediators, the emigrants isolate themselves and 201 live even more strictly religious lives than many in their home countries. Strict moral codes and uncompromising, purist lifestyles are visible phenomena among Muslim emigrants. The Muslims' efforts to isolate themselves are supported by many Europeans, such as Bishop Williams of Canterbury, who endorses Sharia law in Great Britain. He does this, of course, not in the name of Christian charity, but rather to gain greater influence for his church in the judiciary and politics. Left-wing intellectuals behave similarly, equating criticism of Islam in Europe with racism, thereby further stiffening the culture of debate. A gagging, shutting up the mouth forcefully, is imposed more quickly than every argument is countered with a counter-argument. The Sarrazin, Thilo Sarrazin, former state finance minister in Berlin and just a short time ago on the board of the German Central Bank, has written a bestseller. Deutschland schafft sich ab, Germany is doing away with itself. He predicts a dire future for the country and he blames it above all on Islam and the uncontrolled immigration of Muslims, and the minaret debates have made this clear. Criticism is often seen as mere propaganda and grist for the mill of xenophobia. The comparison between criticism of Islam and anti-Semitism is a typical argument. 1. 202. Recalls the terrible events of 70 years ago in Germany to imply that Muslims are today's Jews. At that time, Anti-Semites also warned of the Judaization of Europe, just as Islamophobes today warn of the Islamization of the West. I, too, compare Muslims with Jews in Europe, but for this, I go back to the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm not interested in parallels in aspects of exclusion and discrimination. Instead, I'm devoting myself to the question of how Jews at that time were able to break through their isolation and become bourgeois. Naturally, the pressure from the majority on Jews was great, and politics imposed conditions such as professional adjustment and a new public image. But Jews themselves also took the initiative by participating in education and prosperity. They changed their professional structures and increasingly chose bourgeois professions such as doctor and lawyer. The prerequisites for this were a good education and a command of the German language. At that time, there were no language development programs for minorities, nor any integration commissioners. A religious scholar like Moses Mendelssohn advocated not only for Talmud but also for German and philosophy lessons among his fellow believers. 203. From this spirit, the Haskalah, the Jewish Reformation, emerged. One might claim that this later benefited the Jews nothing, as they fell victim to racial madness despite their efforts. However, this is a false objection, for there is no connection between Jewish emancipation and the Holocaust. Furthermore, the Haskalah benefited European Jews when they emigrated to the USA or Palestine. There, they were able to build on this ideology and build democratic knowledge societies. The attitude that Moses Mendelssohn had inspired among diaspora Jews enabled them to be Jews at home and Germans on the street. I miss this attitude among many Muslims, who consider any other identity inferior to their faith. This is why it is so difficult for them to banish their religious symbols from public spaces. After the negative outcome of the referendum on minarets in Switzerland and the thwarted assassination attempt on the Mohammed cartoonist Kurt Westergaard in Denmark, I hoped that a relaxed culture of debate would finally emerge, in which a profound debate could be conducted on the topics of Islam and migration. My hope was fueled by some media reports in the Islamic world, which this time did not attempt to fuel the anger industry in. 204. The Islamic world, but rather called for reflection and restraint. The Egyptian weekly newspaper El Yawm al-Sabiyah even published a critical report asking about the sins of Muslims that had caused this hostile attitude toward Islam in Europe. At this time, criticism of Islam seemed to be beginning to bear fruit, and this fueled my hopes for a new process of reflection among Muslims about their own failings. And in Europe, while a few extremely rare articles, critical of Islam were published in the mainstream media, my fears were soon confirmed. In Europe, a muzzle is produced faster than any counterargument. On January 14, 2010 alone, the Süddeutsche Zeitung and Berlin's Tagesspiegel published two articles that could have been written by the same person. In an article for the Süddeutsche Zeitung titled "Are Hate Preachers?", Thomas Steinfeld compared Islam critics such as Henrik M. Broder and Nicola Kalek with the Islamic fundamentalists they criticized. The entire text appears, at least in its tenor, to be merely a transcript of Claudia Siedel's article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. #205. Sonntagszeitung of January 10. There, the hate preachers were even described as holy warriors. In the Berlin Tagesspiegel of January 14, 2010, Andreas Flitsch expressed surprise at the harsh criticism of Islam emanating from Muslim ranks, calling it the Cold War of the Enlightened. Flitsch sees the contributions of some Islam critics, such as the US-based Islamic scholar Ibn Warraq, the chairman of the Central Council of Ex-Muslims Mina Ahadi, and the author of these lines, Hamd Abdel Samd, as a crude rehashing of old resentments that should not be confused with the program of enlightenment. What Mr. Flitsch wanted to say between the lines, in my opinion, is this: we still determine what constitutes criticism and what constitutes enlightenment. Muslims who can articulate themselves and take charge do not exist and should not exist, therefore, we Germans must take over this task to protect Muslims from themselves. No, thank you very much, Mr. Flitsch, but I prefer to heal myself. While such comments may be well-intentioned, they in no way help us engage in an honest debate, nor do they encourage Muslims to shed their lethargy. On the contrary, these accusations confirm persistent conspiracy theories and cement the victim mentality of many Muslims. 206. One might consider some criticism of Islam exaggerated or provocative. Personally, I don't agree with everything Nicola Kalek or Henrik M. Broder say, and I have some criticisms of their style. However, I don't consider their criticism of Islam to be Islam's main problem, but rather a reflection of that problem. Islam has a problem with itself, with its claims and worldviews. And it's running out of time. Relativism and licking wounds are the wrong remedies. An ancient Egyptian proverb says, "A true friend makes me cry and cries with me. But he is not a friend who makes me laugh and laughs at me inside." Anyone who truly takes Muslims seriously must criticize Islam. Anyone who wants to talk to them on equal terms should be honest with them instead of treating them as people with mobility impairments. It's bad enough when someone mistakes people for disabled people who aren't. It's even worse when they start limping in front of them to fake their disability, in the illusion of showing solidarity with them. In fact, most Muslims living in the West are not organized in any Islamic associations and live. 207. Rather inconspicuously. And they play no role either in opening Islam to the West or in defusing the radical tendencies among some Muslims abroad. It is certainly their right not to have to interpret their lives in Islamic terms or apologize for the actions of Islamist fanatics. Yet it is precisely from these secular Muslims that the most offended reactions to criticism of Islam often come. Instead of addressing the real problems this religion has with itself and the world, they are more concerned with polishing Islam's public image. They never criticize what Muslims do to other Muslims, but only raise their voices when someone attacks Islam. It is evident that in recent years, especially since September 11, 2001, there has been an Islamization of the migrant problem, both on the part of Muslims and European politicians. While politicians spoke of guest workers until the 1990s, since the beginning of the third millennium, they have spoken of Muslims in Germany. Today, more Muslims in Germany emphasize their Muslim identity and attach importance to displaying their religious symbols in public. Behind this new visibility, however, lies not, as is often assumed, the omnipotence of Islam, but rather a growing insecurity among Muslim immigrants. This often leads to a tense attitude toward the conflicts in their 208 Home countries. Unlike people at home, who can sometimes interpret a conflict in a rational and practical way, the diaspora community often tends to take an emotional stance on conflicts in their home regions that is far removed from reality. If we take the Middle East conflict as an example, we can observe that particularly irreconcilable tones and uncompromising attitudes can be heard primarily from the Muslim and Jewish communities in the USA and Europe. While people there wrestle and negotiate with one another to find practical solutions, very few in the diaspora believe in dialogue and the possibility of reasonable compromises. While in Israel thousands regularly take to the streets demanding that their own government leave the occupied Palestinian territories and evacuate the Jewish settlements, one hears virtually no criticism of Israeli policy from the Jewish diaspora, even though more Jews live abroad than in Israel itself. The diaspora has a guilty conscience. People say, "We're doing well here. It's not our place to tell the people in Israel what to do. We should simply support them," they think. Avi Primer, the former Israeli ambassador to Berlin, replied to my question, "Why is the diaspora 209 more emotional and uncompromising than the people at home? Thousands of Palestinians enter Israel every day to work there." A Palestinian scholar I met at a conference in Bonn called these people collaborators and traitors. Such people are to blame for the fact that we still don't have our own state. They sell out our cause for a little money. Today, Bosnians travel from Bosnian villages to Serbian ones to buy cheap corn. Many of them lost family members in the war. Nevertheless, life goes on for them. First and foremost, they have to consider how to feed their children. On the other hand, a Bosnian who left the region when the war broke out told me he could never imagine shaking hands with a Serb or driving through Serbian territory. Such a rigid attitude is often accompanied by an excessive religiosity that can be interpreted as a symbolic return. This is intended as a form of reparation or compensation to the homeland and family on which one has turned one's back. 210. An emigrant usually arrives abroad with a specific life project and is little interested in the circumstances in the host country. The host country is equally little interested in the life project of the newcomer. All that is expected of them is loyalty and the fulfillment of the task for which they were allowed to immigrate. Many of the hopes that drive people to emigrate remain unfulfilled for most, even after a long stay abroad. The desires for wealth, freedom, independence, and a say are fulfilled for only very few. For poor new immigrants, the relationship between poverty and wealth remains unchanged even in a foreign country. Even if one is financially better off abroad than at home, one is still usually the poorer one. It is interesting to note that as long as Muslim immigrants in Europe enjoyed full employment, they never considered building large, representative mosques. It was only when many of the guest workers became unemployed that they wanted to build magnificent places of worship to prove they had arrived in Europe. There is a plausible psychological explanation for this. Since most immigrants cannot demonstrate their integration through either great wealth or education, they want to compensate for this by building places of worship. Some buy a big BMW, but others commit. 211. Themselves to building mosques to show that they have achieved something in a foreign country. The other explanation is time economics. As long as immigrants were employed, they had no time to think about such projects. It is astonishing that the construction of mosques is now interpreted as a sign of integration, not only by immigrants but also by European politicians. Aside from the fact that magnificent mosques do not reflect the living conditions of most Muslim immigrants, their construction cannot be the beginning of an integration process. Only when immigrants integrate into society through participation in education and prosperity can representative mosques be built as the crowning achievement of the integration process. Only then will they no longer be met with rejection by the majority population. In a foreign country, one belongs to an underprivileged minority. A Muslim stay in Germany is determined by diverse dependencies on the host country, such as residence permit extensions, the asylum process, the employer, or social welfare. These dependencies violate pride or manliness, for the words man and pride are intertwined in many Arabic terms. 212. The rather marginal position of religion in society, as well as the enlightened treatment of sacred symbols common in Europe, unsettle people for whom the sacred is inviolable. An Arab student reported to me that he was horrified when his German classmate told a joke mocking Jesus, Mary, and the Immaculate Conception. How can a society that doesn't understand and doesn't respect its own religion understand or respect ours? Asked the Arab student, who considers Jesus and Mary, as portrayed in the Quran, to be holy figures. In enlightened Europe, everything is subject to critical scrutiny. The Arab student admired this, but also said, I cannot afford to question the foundations of my religion and my culture. Criticism is an addiction, a European disease from which one can never be cured. I can do without analyzing or understanding everything, but I can never do without my faith. Faith is a matter of trust. If I understand everything, where is the trust? The lives of Muslims in Europe are characterized by the contradiction of having to live as a minority in non-Muslim, secular, and rapidly changing societies. The result is often a balancing act between imported customs and European norms. Faith becomes the dominant identity marker, and migration is perceived as exile or mythologized as 213. Such. Therefore, the importance of religion increases for immigrants. In a foreign land, it also offers identity, security, safety, and comfort. Therefore, religion, attachment to one's homeland, and ethnic and cultural identity are almost inseparable in the diaspora. In a foreign land, religion becomes a homeland, not a homeland in which Muslims live, but one that lives within them. In a foreign land, it becomes a substitute for the Ummah. Adherence to religion brings respect and prestige within conservative circles in the diaspora and simultaneously offers an opportunity for a symbolic return to clan and homeland. There is no shortage of examples of the tenacious adherence to traditional religion in the diaspora. For example, the German Protestants who emigrated to Chile in the mid-19th century and established rural settlement colonies in the heart of the Araucanian region. The role of Catholicism among the Irish in the USA. Or that of the Talmud among the Jewish communities scattered throughout the Western and partly Eastern world until the founding of the State of Israel. But every minority had to overcome their own fears at some point and find ways to escape their isolation in order to find their way in a foreign environment. Ms. Seiki is Japanese and runs an 214 online Asian shop in the small Bavarian town of Rosenheim. When she came to Germany with her husband 10 years ago, she didn't speak a word of German. I often stood in the train station and was afraid of the loudspeaker because I couldn't understand anything. If you can't communicate, you inevitably develop an aversion to your surroundings. The fact that shops in Germany close early and the service leaves much to be desired had also bothered her a lot. But slowly, she realized that complaining wouldn't help her, started learning German, and even started her own business. Now I can understand what people are saying and I can express my wishes. That takes away my fear and makes life a lot more pleasant, she says. Now she can even help her 2 children with their homework. Of course, her children also have identity issues, feeling neither German nor Japanese. But parents should remain neutral and not hide these conflicts, she says. Ms. Seki feels not only integrated in Germany, but melted in. She appreciates the relaxed attitude and generosity of the Germans towards strangers. She also likes the fact that they aren't so strict about time. For example, a train is only considered delayed if it's at least 5 minutes late. In Japan, a delay begins after just 15 seconds.